Up until this point, all the Damascus that I've made has been low layer stuff, and I wanted to make something with a little bit more of a respectable number of layers in it. So I started off with this block of 16 layers of steel, and it is about 6 pounds of steel all told. It's a big block of metal, and I figure I'll get enough out of it for at least 5 or 6 times. But as usual with forging together Damascus, it's just a matter of setting the welds and then drawing it all out, and setting the welds and drawing it all out, and cleaning it up between, and redoing it again and again to get more layers. This is why I use a press, because I would not want to draw out a large billet of steel like this without having the mechanical advantage of a press or a power hammer. Anything over about 1 inch square is a lot to draw out by hand, and when I restack this, it's about 3 inches tall and 1.5 inches wide, and about, I think, about 3.5 inches long. I do not get tired of watching the press sped up like this, squishing steel. It's pretty impressive just watching it squish steel in real time, but this is about 4 times the normal speed. And I keep drawing this out to, the first 2 times I draw it out, I draw it to 3/4 of an inch thick and about 2 inches wide. 1.5 inches to 2 inches wide, or 1 3/4 inches wide in the one case. And once I have it drawn to that, to start with, I was just using the flat dies to draw it out to try and keep it straight. In this case, I started using the drawing dies on it, and that's going to start developing a little bit of a pattern in the steel. Because of the way the press squeezes the metal, the dies actually cool the outside of the billet on the top and bottom, and it winds up putting almost like a ladder pattern into the steel when you use the drawing dies, because it squishes the center layers and not the outer layers. Here I was trying to capture, you can see that there's kind of a shadow in this steel in the middle layers. It's sort of a darker color than the upper one. That's something you need to watch for. That tells you you're not quite up to heat all the way through. You need to look for those shadows in the steel. And when those disappear and it becomes one solid color all the way through, that's when it's actually ready to weld. You can have it at welding heat on the outside of the billet and not have it on the inside. And if you still have those shadows in the steel, you need to let it sit in the forge a little longer and soak a little bit more. And the bigger the block, the longer it takes. And here I'm using the drawing dies again to squeeze it out. Like I said, that adds a lot of distortion to the billet, and it's going to add a lot more interest to the pattern. If I was doing something like a mosaic steel, which I have not done yet, but if I was going to try to do something like that, I would probably want to try and stick with a little bit straighter lines in some cases so that I didn't have as much variation in this random pattern, at least until I developed whatever pattern it was I was trying to do. now that it's at its full layer count, which is 256 in this case, I'm going to go ahead and squish out a little bit thinner. Not quite as thin as I would want for a knife billet. That would be taking it down to about 1/4 inch. But, this is a big long piece of steel at this point. It wound up after I lost scale and what I ground off when I was restacking and what I cut away when I was cutting the pieces up. It wound up being about 4 3/4 pounds of steel at the end. Which, as I said, should be enough for more than a few knives. So I'm cutting off a piece that's a little over 2 inches long and about 2 inches wide, and I'm going to grind up the edges to get off any that mess that's on the edges. Whenever you've welded it together, you always have some lines there that look like delaminations, and you want to grind through those to make sure that they don't become a problem later. But then I'm going to draw this out into a bar that I can actually use to make a knife out of, because I want to make a blade and see what this looks like. I haven't made anything that was over 100 layers of Damascus yet. So I do draw this down to about 1/4 inch. And then about 1.5 inches by, it came out a little over 6 inches long, I believe. And I'm going to put a tang on that. That's going to make it even longer still. And then we go to the hand hammer and start hammering out the tang, and then we'll start working on a blade shape. And I didn't at this point really have an idea of what I was making. I just wanted to make a blade shape. I was going to make something hidden tang, didn't know what. And just sort of went with it as we went. And as I start trying to thin it out and put a little bit of a distal taper into it and draw out the edge some, I was starting to see the shape was getting to be more and more like a small chef's knife. Especially when I started pulling out the heel at the very bottom of the blade near the ricasso, or not quite a ricasso, but near the join with the tang. I decided, oh, yes, this is starting to look wide and kind of chef knife shape, so I was thinking that that's what I was going to work on, was a small chef's knife. So a little bit of reshaping and making sure everything's straight. Once it cooled down, I'm going to go ahead to the grinder, and it's going to be with an old 36 grit belt. I'm going to work on just profile and cleaning up the tang and cleaning up the spine and taking off the scale off the blade. And from there I can take and do the initial rough grinding on it. And I'll actually take it to a 120 grit belt too before I heat treat it, just to get a little bit smoother and a little bit less scratch lines that might cause trouble. But it's basically going to be a blade shape by the time I heat treat. And like most chef knives, I went with basically a full flat grind. I haven't yet got into anything fancier than that on them, or on almost any knife. Since this is 1084, it's really simple to heat treat. You just bring it up above non-magnetic and maybe a little warmer, and go ahead and dunk it in some oil. And it almost doesn't matter what type of oil you use. It hardened up very well. Then it's back over to the grinder again. Actually, I took it to the house and I ground it a little bit, took it to the house and put it in the oven to temper it for a couple hours, which I didn't bother filming. And then I took it back over to the shop and we were on the grinder with fresh belts this time. And I started with, I think, an 80 grit belt, and then a 120, and then a 240. And finally I went on to a Trizac belt that's an A36, I believe, which is somewhere around a 400 grit. And that gave a really nice finish. I did try a little bit with the surface conditioning belt, but I don't think it did any better than the Trizac belt did. Then hand sanding happened. Again, I'm not filming 2 hours of hand sanding, but it did happen. And we went on to etching it in some ferric chloride. 2 etches, about 15 minutes each. Results may vary depending on how strong your particular concentration of acid is, and temperature, and a lot of other factors. Well, I've decided I've been taking enough time on this video. I've got way too much footage for just a short YouTube video. So I decided to just sort of cut to the end, and I did not actually film doing the handle on this. It's just I put a curly maple handle on it, which could be fitted much better. But it's comfortable, it makes a nice grip. And this is functionally basically a small chef's knife, about 5.5 inch blade. But the blade turned out awesome looking with the 256 layer Damascus pattern. And now of course we'll get to the part where we just go ahead and test it and see how it works as a knife, since I've got it all sharpened up and ready to go. We'll do a couple of the normal, I'll cut a piece of leather with it because that's what I normally do and I know how that feels. I'll cut a piece of paper with it because for some reason people think that means something. And of course, since this is basically a kitchen knife, I'm going to go ahead and cut some vegetables with it to make dinner. Yeah, like I said, my normal test. Slices leather really well. Skives leather really well. And of course, like I said, some reason people think it's important that it's able to cut paper. But I think, since it's a kitchen knife, it's most important that it's able to cut the things I'm going to cut in a kitchen. I got some carrots and potatoes and some celery here. We'll start with the celery because celery's easy. And then some potatoes. And we'll see if it splits the potato or if it cuts cleanly through. I would say that's a pretty clean cut.